everyone. Welcome to today's virtual town hall, Protect Our Vote, Defending Democracy During COVID-19. We appreciate you all tuning in during these uncertain times, and we hope everyone is staying healthy and safe. My name is Jana Morgan, and I lead the Declaration for American Democracy, a coalition of over 150 organizations representing tens of millions of Americans from the civil rights, environmental, faith, labor, reproductive health, social justice, and other communities serving the public interest. And what we're here to talk about today stems from a really simple concept. You should not have to choose between your health and your vote. And so today's Protect Your Vote virtual town hall will focus on a critically important and bipartisan issue amid the pandemic: the need for swift action and solutions from Congress to secure our right to safely and fairly vote in our elections. And while health experts urge Americans to stay home, too many states fail to offer the options for voters to register to vote or to cast their ballots in a safe and accessible way. So to uphold everyone's right to vote in America this year, Congress must provide states with the $4 billion in funding needed to enact common sense, pro-voter policies so that people of all ages in every state will be able to vote without fear for their health. So to discuss this important issue, we are thrilled that today's town hall will feature a bipartisan group of key leaders in our government, including Senator Amy Klobuchar, Senator Ron Wyden, Senator Elizabeth Warren, House Democratic Caucus Chairman Hakeem Jeffries, and Washington Secretary of State Kim Wyman. We will also feature a number of speakers representing civil society, including the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the National Disability Rights Network, the Brennan Center for Justice, the League of Women Voters Wisconsin, Common Cause, People for the American Way, Stand Up America, and Public Citizen. Now, before we officially kick off today's conversation, I want to thank all of our members for helping to make this town hall possible. Thank you all for your passion and for your commitment to these issues. And thanks to all of you for joining us here today. So with that, I am excited to now turn the mic over to our first speaker, U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, for her remarks. Senator Klobuchar. Oh, I think you might be muted, Senator.
Is it good now?
Perfect.
Nothing worse than a muted senator. Anyway, I wanted to, first of all, thank you for what you're doing and putting everyone together like this. This is the hardest time I think many of us can ever remember. And we know yet how big the stakes are. I personally have been through this myself when my husband got really, really sick and was in the hospital, and was able to see firsthand how horrific this is, where you can't stand by your loved one's side and hold their hands, and you can't give hugs to the healthcare workers, and they're the ones holding up the phone to their ears. And I know we're going to find a way out of this, but to me, the only way we really find a way out of this is to make sure that we have a functioning democracy. And that's why I am so devoted to this issue. And all of the things we were talking about before the pandemic, from making progress in a big way on climate change, we cannot wait. Doing something about gun safety, on racial disparity, on economic inequalities, we have to move now. And the way we do it is with our democracy. So that's why we are working so hard to pass our bill that Ron and I have been leading, well, each of us in different ways for years, but that is to make it easier for people to vote. And right now, we have a big opportunity coming up with the COVID-4 proposal. And that would allow us to put more funding in place for our states, as well as get some of these reforms in place. So let me walk through what this is like right now. I don't think I have to give you stats. You saw it all in Wisconsin. You saw what happened when a Republican legislature decided not to allow the Democratic governor to delay the election like so many other governors have done for people's own health. And what we saw instead was people standing in garbage bags with masks, coming off shifts at a hospital and having to risk their lives, just to be able to exercise their right to vote. While meanwhile, in the luxury of his home on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Donald Trump orders a mail-in ballot with his wife. That's what they did. They were able to get their ballot from Palm Beach and vote that way, as he has done many times in the past. That's a case that we have. And I think one of the strongest arguments we have as we work to get this funding and get these reforms in place in the next package is not just that inequity, but it's the fact that the voters in Wisconsin, they acted. They knew those Republicans were playing with their lives and were literally trying to take the election away from them and trying to literally play politics. Meanwhile, we have other Republicans like the Secretary of State of Washington that you're going to hear from who've been working toward constructive change, or some of the governors around the country who believe that people should have the right to vote. So that is the political strategy, very clear. And that is that we think we can get bipartisan support for the funding. The reforms, we're going to fight like hell to get those reforms in. Those are things like this. 20 days early, keeping the polling places open. We know for certain some states, 4 to 5% of the people are voting early right now, are voting by ballot. And so we know by the mail, we know that we're going to have to keep these polling places open as well. We know that there'll be people voting on election day. So we want to train a new generation of poll workers. And that the funding includes that as well as requirements to break down some of these heinous things that are going on. For instance, 6 states in our country right now require either 2 witnesses or a notary to be able to get a mail-in ballot. Think about it, a notary. There's actually a story of someone that has a notary through a window in an assisted living when they were trying to get an early ballot for a primary. So our bill would knock down those barriers and make it very straightforward that people should be able to vote without those barriers in place. That's what we're doing. I'm actually very excited to be working with my friend Ron, and I appreciate the work that Elizabeth's been doing, who I know you're going to hear from, as well as Hakeem, whose district has been so hard hit by coronavirus, and all the groups on the call. This should be something that we can all unite on. And I know Mitch McConnell has stood in the way of election reform many times in the past. I've tried to get the backup paper ballots, but I think you're starting to see Republicans that are interested in working with us, at least on the money piece of this. And that's going to be our goal with the COVID-4 package. And overall, I just want to thank you, because we know that voter suppression has been going on for a long time, but I don't think we ever thought it would come to be what we saw in Wisconsin. And we just have to make the case for people. Why would you disallow a veteran, a senior who's a veteran, from voting because he can't take the risk to go to the polls? Why would you make hospital workers who have no ability to get a notary or get 2 witnesses because every day they go to risk their lives, why would you make them do that? We're going to have such a strong case to make for America. And I just can't wait to the work we're going to be doing in the next month to push this through. And the other thing I'd mention is just the effect this has had on our minority communities. You saw the people standing in line in Milwaukee. You saw how they reduced the poll locations from over 100 to 5, in Green Bay from 31 to 2. So we have a big racial argument to make on this case. We have a strong freedom and constitutional rights argument to make, and we have a democracy argument to make. So we're ready to go. And I know you're going to hear that from Ron as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Senator Klobuchar, for your remarks. I think you touched on a lot of really important points, but we actually also have a question for you that was sent in by Fred Wertheimer, who is the president of Democracy 21. And he asks, you are known for striving to work in a bipartisan fashion and being able to obtain Republican co-sponsors for the bills that you introduce. So do you think that we can get any Senate Republican support for substantially more funding for the states to run their elections, since there's strong support from Republican as well as Democratic state election officials on the need for these funds? And I know you touched on this a little bit, but perhaps you could elaborate just a bit more.
Yeah, I do. And I'll look forward to having you hear from the Republican Secretary of State from Washington State, as she's been such a leader on this. The Iowa Secretary of State said they need the funds yesterday. And you have governors in states like Maryland and New Hampshire and Ohio that are Republicans that are pushing for this money. Now, that being said, I don't want to sound naive here because we know in Congress there are problems. Roy Blunt, the two of us chair the Rules Committee, he has publicly come out against the reforms, but has said that they are open to getting more money. And so it's our job to work with our leadership to push for the reforms as well as for the funding. And one thing I did forget to mention, not on the Republican front, but Ron and I were really excited that Michelle Obama endorsed our bill. We thought that was pretty good. She hasn't done a lot of political things since they left the White House, and that we've been able to work with so many other groups, including the ones on this call. So again, I don't want to be a Pollyanna. I'm the one that's run into a buzzsaw with Mitch McConnell many times over backup paper ballots and the like. It's one of the reasons they gave him that nickname about Russia. And so, you know, it is what it is. But I still think the overwhelming support, the poll numbers are just out of the park on this with all the people that want to see change. And so it's on all of us and the groups on this call to make the case. And we have a clear target with a lot of people at our side.
Thank you so much, Senator Klobuchar, for all the incredible work you're doing to secure our vote and fighting to make sure every American will have access to the polls. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Senator Klobuchar also serves on the Judiciary Committee and is ranking member of the Rules Committee. Now, for those of you who are just joining in, this is the Protect Our Vote Town Hall Kickoff. We are speaking with government leaders about what action must be taken in order for us to be able to safely vote in our elections this year. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, another national leader in the fight for expanding voting rights, U.S. Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon. Senator?
Jan, a big thanks to the Declaration for American Democracy. And I'd offer up that this is not a complicated matter. The bill that I have written with Senator Klobuchar protects your right to vote safely, no matter where in America you live. The bottom line is, it is time to COVID-proof elections in America. Now, back in 2002, when I proposed the first legislation to allow Americans to vote by mail, it was considered kind of an academic exercise. A lot of professors wrote papers speculating about voter turnout or which political party would benefit. It was kind of interesting to see the tweed jacket set go out and debate the whole issue. It is academic no longer. Vote by mail is now the linchpin to safe voting. And that is especially true for vulnerable populations, like older people, older women, for example, many of whom have actually served in the military and have already risked their lives for this country once. They shouldn't be asked to risk their lives again. Now, Senator Klobuchar and I did not reinvent the wheel in writing this bill. America is already moving in our direction. Today, bright red Nebraska announced that it has seen unprecedented requests for absentee ballots. Lighter red Ohio is moving to a mail-in primary. Maryland, with a Republican governor, is holding a mainly vote-by-mail primary. All of these are states governed by Republicans. So it is hard to see the Donald Trump theory that voting by mail is some kind of giant liberal conspiracy. The last point that I would make, Jana, is that our bill does not federalize the fall elections, nor does it perpetrate any other kind of nonsense that some constitutionally illiterate politicians are out there peddling. And if anybody who's following us tonight wants the details and wants to see how simple it is, I have actually demonstrated voting by mail in my dining room in a tweet that I have pinned tonight at the top of my feed. So big thanks for all you're doing. I understand we may have a question. So let me also thank Hakeem and Elizabeth, because we are all rowing in this together.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Senator Wyden. We do have a question for you. We have a question from Mike Latner, who is a senior fellow at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And he says, as you know, Oregon was the first state to adopt universal vote by mail, and you played a big role in making that happen. So how has vote by mail affected voter turnout in Oregon, and what lessons could other states learn from Oregon's system during this pandemic?
We have a little bit of unique history, Jana, to offer the country. When I became America's first vote by mail senator in 1996, the Republicans supported the process. At that time, the Democrats were opposed. But after I became the first new senator in 34 years, everything was reversed. The Democrats said they love vote by mail. The Republicans said, oh my goodness, it's going to be the end of Western civilization. Now, back then, Gordon Smith, who was a Republican leader in our legislature, got elected to the US Senate later in that year. So at that point, Oregon voters said, enough with all of this silliness. We like voting by mail, whether we're conservatives or liberals or where we fall, and they put it actually on the ballot, and it passed overwhelmingly. So vote by mail is something that Oregonians of all philosophies have weighed in on. And what we have seen is that studies show it is cheaper, it increases turnout, and Republicans, including our late and very well-respected Republican Secretary of State, Dennis Richardson, said in a letter to President Trump that fraud was basically non-existent. So I would just say to anybody who's following this, if you're tired of standing in line for hours to vote, worried about whether an electronic machine is secure, or you can't just get time off from work to go to the polls, or you just want to be safe. Tonight, our message is the better way is to vote by mail.
Thank you so much, Senator Wyden, for joining us today. We very much appreciate you, and it's really heartening to hear you talk about not just the Democratic states that are working to institute vote by mail and other reforms, but also the Republican states that are doing so as well. Thank you very much for joining us, and take care.
Thank you.
Senator Wyden is also the ranking member on the Senate Finance Committee, and he also serves on the Budget and Energy and Natural Resources Committee. And I think it's also important to mention that one of the states that has been doing vote by mail the longest is the very red state of Utah. So now I'm thrilled to introduce our next speaker, U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. Senator Warren. Oh, Senator, I think you might be on mute.
No, I'm not. So thank you again. It is so good to be here, and good to be here with Declaration for American Democracy. I appreciate everyone getting together. A virtual town hall is not quite like being in person, but at least we're here, and at least we're talking about the important issues. You know, I think of this as voting is the beating heart of our democracy, and it shouldn't be partisan, but it now has become partisan. And we all heard Donald Trump saying a couple of weeks ago that no, we can't let everyone vote, because if everyone voted, then the Republicans would never win another election. And, you know, we could all roll our eyes about Donald Trump, but I really do think we have to pause for a minute and think about the fact that one of our two major political parties has basically said their plan, the two things intersect. And that is the voting, how dangerous it has become to vote, and how far the Republicans are willing to go to keep people from voting. I see this as a moment when the accountability of our elected officials cannot be higher. So making sure that people get the chance to vote, making sure that come November of 2020, everyone is going to have an opportunity to vote should be a highest priority for us. So I put out a plan for this. You're not surprised. Put it out a couple of weeks ago. And basically it starts where we start a lot of things, and that is with money. It's going to take money to make sure that we can do voting by mail. So $4 billion seems to be the number that everyone has settled on so that everyone in the United States can receive a postage prepaid envelope to be able to vote and receive their ballots. In addition to that, we need to make sure that people can register online, that we have an extended registration period, and that we have safe in-person voting. So we need the resources there to make it happen in all of the parts so that people will be able to vote. That's part one. Part two, we have to protect our post office and our postal system. And voting by mail is just one more reminder why we need a postal system. We need to put money into the postal system to make sure that it is there for us every single day in terms of delivering letters and packages as people are using it now during this crisis, but also as a critical part of our democracy. Vote by mail means we need a strong postal system. Third, we need to protect poll workers. And that means making sure that they have the protective gear that they need, that they have appropriate sanitation supplies, that they have good training, that they are fully protected. And fourth, as much as we talk about voting by mail, and I'm a huge fan of voting by mail, go Ron, I believe that nationally we have to protect in-person voting as well. Voting by mail works for a lot of people, but it doesn't work for everyone. And there are those who have particular challenges with voting by mail. People who are living on tribal lands, for example, sometimes in communities of color. It's important to be able to rely on voting in person. So we want to make sure that there are adequate resources to support in-person same-day voting as well, and early voting. My view on this is we know basically what we need. And I think it was Amy who said, you know, this is not rocket science. We know kind of what the basic pieces are and what we need to require every state to do in a federal election. We know what we need to do. We need to get it into the next Corona package that comes out. So we need to make sure that when we're putting this big negotiation together, that our number one priority is that we protect the right of people to vote, so nobody has to choose between their health and their ability to exercise their rights as an American citizen. It is more important now than ever before in our lives to protect our democracy. And the way we do that is we put federal laws in place that provide the resources and also require access to the ballot for every American citizen. That's what this is about.
Great. Thank you so much for your remarks, Senator Warren. They're very powerful and I think speak to a lot of the challenges that we are going to be facing in making sure we have a safe and secure election in November. But we do have a question for you, if you don't mind, from Tiffany Muller, President of Let America Vote and the End Citizens United Action Fund. She wrote, "We cannot let what happened with elections in Wisconsin happen nationwide in November. What is the single most important thing people at home can do to make sure that this upcoming stimulus package has what we need to protect our elections this fall?"
Oh, great question. And I love that you care enough to say not only do you sort of think we're right, but you're actually ready to get out there and do something about it. So the first thing is show up. And I know that means virtually now because we're all at home here. You can see I'm on my back porch here. But show up, go to the town halls, go to any town hall you can. When you hear about them online, lots of members of Congress right now, both in the Senate and in the House, are holding virtual town halls. Show up and ask a question. Ask a question about voting and ask a question about the post office. Ask a question about funding. Ask a question about whenever they're talking about coronavirus. Say, yeah, and how's that going to relate to our ability to vote without putting lives at risk? It's the single most important thing you can do. And if your senators or your person in Congress are not holding town halls, heck, call them, email them, get in touch with them virtually as often as you can. Just put it on your to-do list. Call them today and call them again tomorrow. And call others. When I say call, I mean this in every sense of the word, whether you're text or whether you use Facebook a lot, however it is you do it. But get in touch with lots of people. Now is our chance. This is put wind in the sails. And the way we do that is we make our voices heard by the people in the Senate, the people in the House who are going to be voting very soon on the next Corona package. We want to make sure we get this top of the list, powerfully important. So whoever your senators are, whoever your rep is, whether red or blue, let them know how important this is to you. And then I know you said just one thing, but I want to mention, because you can't say it often enough, vote, vote, vote. You've got to show up and vote and bring other people with you. Get other people engaged. Volunteer, get others to volunteer. This is the moment. And I know we always talk about most important election in your lifetime until you see the next one. This one really is. And our ability for this democracy to continue to function, to actually be the way that the people make their will known, that really is now on the line. Now that we have a political party that plans to use as its strategy, keep American citizens from voting. And they are so confident in that strategy, they're willing to talk openly about it. Now is the moment. We have got to get the rules in place to protect this vote come next November. We don't want to be in a position of talking about an election that got stolen. We don't want to be in a position of talking about the long lines or people who decided not to go because they were afraid of being sick. We don't want to be in that position. And now is when we have the chance, when the door is open, that we can get the changes that we need to make. So thank you all. Thank you for having me here tonight, Jana. We've got a long road ahead of us, but it's one that we know is the right road for us to travel. This is a road about saving our country. This is a road about saving our democracy. And I am proud to be in the fight alongside all of you. So thank you very much for having me tonight.
Thank you so much, Senator Warren, and for really kind of painting a picture of the seriousness of the moment that we are in and why it is so important that everyone do whatever they can to make their voices heard. We really appreciate you being here, so take care.
Thank you.
Senator Warren also serves on the Banking Committee and is a ranking member of the Financial Institutions and Consumer Protection Act Subcommittee. She also serves on the Committee on Armed Services. And I was struck by something she was saying about the fact that we need to get this money into the next package and that these types of reforms are not rocket science. These types of reforms of postage paid ballots, online registration, making sure there are safe places to vote. These are things that are happening all over the United States, but to varying degrees. And we need to make sure that these things happen nationally and that everyone gets to vote in any way that makes the most sense for them. And also, I should use this as a moment to plug. Senator Warren said that we should all be showing up to town halls and asking questions of our representatives. I should mention again that this is the first in a series of town halls that we are putting on as the Declaration for American Democracy. We will have town halls coming up in Maine, Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia, and Colorado. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. I think we have our next speaker ready. Our next speaker is House Democratic Caucus Chairman Hakeem Jeffries, serving New York's 8th Congressional District. Representative?
Well, thank you, Jana, and good evening to everyone. Thank you, Common Cause, for your continued work in making sure that you protect the integrity of our democracy in a variety of different ways, and for convening us all here today. It's an honor, of course, to join along with my good friends Amy and Ron and Senator Elizabeth Warren and all of the distinguished guests that you have lined up. You know, here in Brooklyn and in New York City, we've been hit hard. This is the epicenter of the coronavirus crisis and the pandemic that has swept across much of the world. And in New York City, certainly in Brooklyn, I mean, we consider ourselves to be pretty tough and pretty resilient individuals. We've been hit hard with a variety of different crises over the last 2 decades. We were knocked down, of course, by 9/11 and the attacks on the towers. Thousands of people lost their lives. We were able to recover from that. We were knocked down by the Great Recession, and we were ultimately able to come back from that. We were hit hard in 2013 in my district and in other districts by Superstorm Sandy, and we were able to come back from that. But in many ways, this moment that we confront now, both the public health aspects of the pandemic as well as the economic crisis, has elements of all three: 9/11, the Great Recession, Superstorm Sandy, wrapped up into one. The ferocity of a hurricane, the economic dynamics of a Great Recession, as well as the trauma of the loss of life that we first experienced in 9/11. All of those elements are present now. And so this is a tough one for us to navigate our way through. And in this context, it's just unfathomable that many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will conclude that we don't want to make it easier to participate in our democracy. We want to make it harder. It'd be very difficult for us to do so here in New York City and to ensure that people at a moment when we need government, making sure that you have a robust system in place for in-person voting by extending out the early voting opportunities, as well as the opportunities to vote perhaps on election day in multiple polling sites so you can socially distance yourself in an effective way. It's got to be a combination to ensure that every American can vote. The last point that I'll make in this area is that over the last 3+ years, we've been compelled to think about a lot of the founding values of this country because of the dynamics of who's serving in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue right now. And we know that it's a country that was founded on several high ideals, founded on the principle of checks and balances, separate and co-equal branches of government, the independent judiciary, the free and fair press, the preeminence of the rule of law, and government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And you can't have self-government unless there's a meaningful opportunity for the American people to participate. And at the end of the day, that's what this democracy reform effort is all about. And in the House, from Speaker Pelosi down through every single member of the caucus, including the 62 members of the freshman class, we are committed to bringing our democracy to life in November.
Thank you so much, Representative Jeffries. We really appreciate you being here. And we do have a good question for you from Stacy Long Simmons, the Director of Advocacy and Action at the National LGBTQ Task Force Action Fund. She writes that on April 7th, hundreds of thousands of Wisconsin voters were unnecessarily forced to risk their health in order to exercise their right to vote. Hundreds of thousands more were potentially disenfranchised because they didn't receive absentee ballots in time or could not risk their health to vote in person. These adversities are particularly harmful to racial and ethnic minorities, older adults, LGBTQ people, and others. So how can we make sure that the Wisconsin primary isn't replicated 50 times this November?
Yeah, it's a great question. We want to make sure that it's not replicated 50 times plus, because of course we have Washington, D.C., as well as the territories. And in Washington, D.C., at least, those residents will be able to weigh in on who is elected as president of the United States of America. It's a great question. We are committed, as we negotiate, as my colleagues in the Senate have said, the next coronavirus relief package, which in the House at least we're labeling as CARES 2.0. Sorry for all of these mathematical equations. I know my Senate colleagues have labeled it COVID-19 4.0, but in the House CARES 2.0, it's our view that we have to make sure that we provide the funding necessary, building upon the $400 million that was in CARES 1.0, but we have to go much further to ensure that every single state and the territories can fully implement mail-in voting in November, and that the ballots can be provided to every single voter free of charge, with their ability to mail it back in and or drop it off if they choose, but to mail it back in without any financial burden on them. And so we had a call earlier today, the House Democratic Caucus, about 210 members were on, including all of our leadership. And Speaker Pelosi once again made it clear, and this is the view of the members as well, that this is one of our top priorities in terms of negotiating the provisions of CARES 2.0, because our democracy is at stake. We're in the midst of a pandemic. We cannot force Americans to have to choose between their health and well-being and the well-being of our democracy and their ability to vindicate that precious value of self-government, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so we link arms with our colleagues in the Senate and all of Common Cause and all of the advocates who are joined in this effort. And we're going to work as hard as we can to get this done.
Thank you so much, Chairman Jeffries, for joining us today. Please stay safe out there, and we appreciate all the work that you've done.
Thank you very much.
Chair Jeffries is a member of the Judiciary Committee and Budget Committee, and a member of the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And I just want to emphasize something he said. As a Washington, D.C. citizen, I appreciate him remembering the district and remembering the citizens in the district and in the other U.S. territories that also need funding to be able to safely vote in our elections this year. And I was also heartened to hear that this is a top priority for House leadership. So we're very grateful for that. And now we're going to hear from Washington Secretary of State, Kim Wyman. Secretary Wyman.
Hello, Jana, thank you so much for putting this together. This town hall is wonderful, and I'm really honored to be a part of it. It's been really interesting to hear my colleagues in the Senate and the House in Washington, D.C. Talk about vote by mail, and this is something here in Washington State we've been doing for almost a decade now as a state. And this, I realize, is going to date me, but this is my 8th presidential election as an election administrator. And I mention that because I think my take might be a little different than what we've heard from the speakers already, in that I don't think vote by mail as an option in the COVID-19 social distancing environment we find ourselves in is a Democrat or Republican issue. This is about instilling confidence in the public that our elections are fair and that they are accessible and secure. And election officials' jobs really is to make sure that the most left-leaning progressive Democrat to the most conservative right-wing Republican and every voter in between believes that the election was accessible and secure, because for those things to happen, it makes the election fair and it makes it accurate. And so really what we need to be focusing on as a country is building out the capacity for these states that are going to have elections, primaries in the coming months, and then of course building to the November general election, building out the infrastructure so that we can conduct elections that have the compensating controls to balance out sending a ballot potentially to every single voter in their state. And each state is going to need to have options that will vary, because some states are just simply not ready to flip the switch from 2 to 3% of their ballots being cast by mail to casting 100% of their ballots by mail. But what we do need to do is make sure those states have options and that they can build out the infrastructure so that they can see an increase of maybe, 50% to 75% of their ballots being cast by mail. I think that's a real strong possibility in many states across the country. They're going to need to have the infrastructure in terms of space in their buildings to have people process those ballots, have high-speed scanning equipment to scan the ballot envelopes that are coming back in and sort them and do it in an efficient manner. And then also build out the capacity to backfill all of these employees who they use on a seasonal basis to process ballots, work in polling places that now can't work. When you're talking about a workforce whose average age is about 70, I know in our state at least, I would say that 2/3 of our workers are not going to be able to return this fall and help in those elections. So we're going to have to also have the biggest recruitment effort nationwide of workers to backfill those positions and have ones on hand in case some of those workers heavy lift. And I think if we all pull together and stop worrying about how it is going to advantage or disadvantage the party that we're in or the other party, and really start focusing on how are we going to make sure that people believe the results of the election, we're all going to be better for it. And I know we can achieve it. So that's what election officials across the country are working on. And I look forward to working with the people on this call at this town hall meeting to get to that end.
Thank you, Secretary Wyman. And of course, you've said it just right. This isn't about benefiting Democrats. This isn't about benefiting Republicans. This is about benefiting Americans and making sure that every citizen can access the ballot. Mm-hmm. And so we have a question for you. This is from Gary Decker, who is the Issue Campaigns Director for the Alliance for Youth Action. This one's kind of a two-parter, so you'll forgive us for that. What would your advice be to fellow secretaries of states who have concerns related to the partisan implications, implementation, challenges, and security of vote by mail? And then how can secretaries of states ensure that there are resources available to educate young people and first-time voters about the vote by mail process so that they feel prepared to participate in November?
Well, the thing I would say, and have been saying, quite frankly, to my colleagues across the country is first and foremost, assess what your infrastructure is currently. And with the 50 states and the territories and Washington, D.C., keeping in mind what resources you have. And again, it's going to depend on where you're at right now with your absentee voting. So if you're a state like mine that is completely vote by mail, you have different challenges and infrastructure than a state where maybe 3 or 4% of your votes are cast by an absentee ballot. So first and foremost, do that infrastructure check. And how are you going to mitigate the fact that you will have a dramatic increase in absentee ballots? Do you have centralized tabulation machines that can put the throughput of ballot counting through your system? Hundreds of thousands of ballots that need to be counted maybe in a central environment when you're right now counting those in polling places across your state. And I guess my biggest piece of advice would be really to check in with states like Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado, those states that have a lot of experience doing vote by mail elections, and learn from us, learn from our hard lessons. And sometimes that came from mistakes, but also the things that have worked well to make vote by mail work in our states. And then finally, in terms of voter outreach, it's not only to the youth vote, it's to any voter who hasn't voted absentee before. And really, it's multiple platforms, just like you would any voter information campaign, doing it in social social media platforms, doing it in the news media, and doing it in print form that you send to voters and give them information. Provide those services online so that they can have their questions answered and can be successful in making sure that their ballot gets counted when it's returned to election officials.
Great. Thank you so much, Secretary Wyman, for joining us today. So Secretary Wyman has been speaking virtually across the country with both Democratic and Republican secretaries of states to emphasize the importance of working across the aisle to secure our elections this year. And in fact, solutions like she spoke about, like vote by mail, have popularity across the political spectrum, as do solutions like early voting, online and same-day voter registration. And these things all need to kind of come together in one so that people can choose from a variety of options to be able to cast their vote. And so next up, we have a video of remarks from former Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Steele. In this video, he discusses the important bipartisan nature of protecting every American's right to vote with universal vote by mail during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I want to thank our partners that represent us who provided us with this video from one of their recent unrigged virtual roundtables. Let's turn to the video.
First off, again, going back to my time in public office, my belief has always been that if you make the case to the people, if it's a good case, you don't have to worry about the vote, right? Your vote's going to be there for you, and I can get Democrats to vote for me. Secretary Ron can get Democrats to vote for her. We can get Democrats can get Republicans to vote for them. So why is this a wrong-headed view? It's looking largely through a political lens. To think that if you allow voters to stay at home and vote, that somehow hurts your own vote is crazy. Why? Because when you look at who makes up the Republican vote, just for example, a lot of voters 50 and over, all right? So they have a larger proportion of elderly voters who vote for them. They're not going to go and stand in line at a poll, number one. Number two, they are the volunteers in a lot of cases at these polling places, so they're not there to volunteer. So to disenfranchise them that way, to me, is just boneheaded. It makes no sense. Don't think that when it comes to voting this November, that someone's going to raise their hand and propose, you know what, I just don't think we should hold a national election because of COVID-19. Well, I'm going to be out there screaming from every mountain I can have and find, hell no. And that's what every American has to do. You have to take this seriously, because if you don't, they will strip as much of it away from you as they can. They will continue to gerrymander you into districts that don't make sense. They will continue to move your polling places so grandma now has to catch 2 buses to vote. And guess what? Grandma just don't go vote. Well, that's too bad, right? Yeah. So we own this franchise. It was given to us under the Constitution. It is the way we define our government. Those buildings and those elected officials don't get to define the game. We do. You got to stand up. You got to be loud. Work with the secretaries of states. Help them put in place the infrastructure. Volunteer. Be a part of the solution in changing the direction we are now headed when it comes to voting in this country. 50% turnout, 45% turnout is crazy. It doesn't make sense. Young people, get off your behind. Take it seriously. Go vote.
So thanks again to our friends at Represent Us for providing this video, which just further emphasizes why this isn't an issue for just Democrats or a Republican issue, but one that hits at the core of our democracy. Thank you to all of our government leaders for speaking with us today. We appreciate your work to stand up and advocate for our right to safely access the ballot box in our primary elections and in our elections in November. Now, for those of you who are just joining in, this is the national kickoff of the Declaration for American Democracy's Protect Our Vote virtual town hall series. We are speaking with elected officials and voting rights experts about what action Congress must take to ensure that we can all safely and securely exercise our right to vote this year. To learn more, please go to our website at declarationforamericandemocracy.org. Now, our next set of speakers represent organizations advocating for equal access to the ballot box, particularly for vulnerable communities who already face significant challenges to participating in our democracy. These challenges are being further exacerbated because of the complications of the coronavirus. So to start us off, I will turn it over to Vanita Gupta, the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, followed by Michelle Bishop, a voting rights specialist at the National Disability Rights Network. Vanita.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much. I'm Vanita Gupta, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, a coalition of more than 200 national organizations working to build an America as good as its ideals. Thank you to the Declaration for American Democracy for hosting this call. The Leadership Conference is proud to be part of the DFAD coalition to ensure that our democracy works for all of us. And I want to thank Senator Klobuchar, Senator Wyden, Senator Warren, Congressman Jeffries, and Secretary Wyman, and all of my colleagues on this call for their leadership for fair and safe elections. Our nation is in a state of emergency, and so too is our democracy. We all saw what happened in Wisconsin, with voters forced to choose between their safety and their vote, and we cannot allow that to happen ever again. With under 7 months until the general election, states have next to no time to spare in preparing for November amid this pandemic. Given this country's dark history of denying voters of color access to the ballot box, we have to be ever vigilant to guard against any obstacles to prevent our communities from voting. That means that Congress must ensure that every person's voice and vote count as we build a future together. This is a massive undertaking. Congress recently passed a relief package, but the bill fell woefully short of protecting our democracy. Lawmakers approved only $400 million for state election assistance. Civil rights groups are calling on Congress to secure an additional $3.6 billion in additional funding to afford every voter a fair, safe, and accessible opportunity to cast their ballot. Some people have pitched vote by mail as the universal solution to voter access. There's no question that vote by mail is an essential part of an election response amid the pandemic, but voters have to also have a very clear range of options to cast their ballot. Focusing exclusively on vote by mail could actually disenfranchise voters of color and other communities who've historically faced barriers to the ballot. Surveys show that states reject absentee ballots at far greater rates for Black and Latino voters and other voters of color than for white voters. And studies have also shown that voters of color vote by mail at lower rates, sometimes due to historical mistrust of the postal system and the mail-in ballot process. Vote by mail systems can also impose hurdles for Native American voters who may not live or have postal addresses that are living on tribal lands, given that many really have limited access to postal services and the like. And voting by mail does not adequately serve communities that tend to move frequently, such as students and low-income families. But vote by mail remains a really important option. There just have to be guardrails in place, including prepaid postage, the ability to postmark an absentee ballot on or before Election Day, relaxing technical requirements, and increased availability of drop boxes in all communities. States need to give voters options for safe voting amid the pandemic. Along with expanding vote by mail, states have got to ensure full voter access by establishing safe in-person polling places. States should also extend early voting periods for at least 2 weeks prior to the election, expand online voter registration options, and distribute information to the public about voting changes. It's going to require a massive voter education effort to make sure everyone knows of the new changes. There is no question that no one should have to choose between public health and functioning democracy. The decisions that our leaders make now are going to determine not just how we weather the storm, but the kind of democracy we're going to have when it's over. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Vanita. And now I want to turn it over to Michelle. And Michelle, I think you're on mute, so you just want to unmute.
I am muted. Thank you. This is Michelle Bishop. I am the Voting Rights Specialist for the National Disability Rights Network. We are a national membership association based in Washington, D.C., but our member organizations are in every state, territory, and district in the United States and are mandated through the Help America Vote Act to protect access to the vote for people with disabilities. If I could tell you one thing tonight, it's that whether or not there's a global pandemic, America's electoral system is not accessible to people with disabilities. The federal government has studied this, and we found that polling places, less than half are actually compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act, somewhere around 40%. Now, you might say, What could possibly be less accessible than that? And unfortunately, the answer to that question is actually vote by mail. There are a lot of compelling reasons right now for vote by mail. We're supposed to be staying at home. We're supposed to be socially distancing, and vote by mail enables that for a lot of folks. Unfortunately, let's say you have a voter who's blind, who goes to their polling place, and they're given a pen and a paper ballot and asked to fill it out. That voter who's blind can't see and fill out that ballot privately and independently, and while protecting the secrecy of that ballot. Well, if you mail that same voter a paper ballot to his home, he doesn't magically become sighted when he sits down at his kitchen table. It's still inaccessible. We have to have options that make vote by mail accessible for everyone, including people with all types of disabilities. The closest we've come at this point, and we've made some progress, thanks in large part to those vote by mail states. In many of those states, you can have a ballot sent to you electronically, and you can mark it on the technology that you have at home. But typically that requires at some point in the process being able to print out that ballot. Once again, you're left with a piece of paper that you can't verify if you can't see it, or can't return if you can't physically handle the paper, even under normal circumstances. Now you add in the COVID-19 pandemic where we can't leave our homes. And I don't know about you, but I'm also at home and I don't even own a printer. So that method isn't even accessible to me right now when I can't go to my office or go down the street to my local library to print out that ballot. There are a handful of systems that actually allow you to electronically return your completed ballot, but they are constantly under attack by election security advocates, and they often actually produce a paper ballot on the back end that is actually tallied and maintained by your elections official, which means at some point, a paper ballot is produced that the voter never sees. And once again, they can't verify their vote. So while we've made a lot of progress in making vote by mail more accessible, we're not all the way there. That becomes a really big problem when we talk about vote by mail's capacity to protect the most vulnerable. As you heard from Senator Wyden, you also heard something incredibly important from Senator Warren, and that's the need to protect in-person voting options. I believe that that's true. There's some people for whom vote by mail is just not going to work. We have to have in-person voting options, and we have to be able to make them as safe as possible. But what also concerns me is that we can't say, we're so sorry, our vote by mail isn't accessible. So people with disabilities who are considered among the most vulnerable in terms of COVID-19, you are the ones who will have to take to the streets to go and vote in person because we failed to make our vote by mail accessible for you. Everyone who's eligible deserves to cast their ballot, but everyone who casts their ballot deserves to live. We simply have to do better by Americans with disabilities and make every method of casting your ballot fully accessible and compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Our democracy depends on it.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Vanita, for your very compelling remarks and for reminding us that the fight to protect every American's right to vote has been going on since this country began, and it still continues today, especially for communities of color, for voters with disabilities, and others. So as we look to find solutions to voting during this pandemic, we also need to know that vote by mail is not the easy answer. It is not the only answer. So we have to be careful about how we talk about it. It must be implemented in concert with other options that ensure accessibility for all voters, including in-person voting options and options for voters with disabilities. Thank you, Vanita and Michelle.
Thank you.
So what are some of the ways that what are some of the reforms that we can implement that will provide accessibility for the most Americans that we can? Now we're going to hear from an expert who will speak to those important solutions that must be enacted to ensure all Americans, including our most vulnerable communities, do not have to choose between their safety or their vote. I'd like to introduce Max Feldman, counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice.
Thanks so much, Jana. I want to thank the Declaration for American Democracy for organizing this important event, my fellow speakers for all that they're doing to defend our democracy, and all of you participating in this town hall for standing up for our rights and for our country. Let me start by adding my voice to those who have already called for Congress to appropriate $4 billion for our elections this year. In the face of this insidious virus, we're going to have to make serious modifications to our election systems. We can't afford to do democracy on the cheap. It's critical that Congress step up and fully fund our elections this year. Now, why do we need $4 billion? Well, you've heard a lot of the reasons already. The Brennan Center's put together a plan for how to protect the 2020 election from coronavirus, and we're working arm in arm with other advocates on this call and off to get our recommendations implemented in the states. The basic principles are these. We believe that states should offer every voter the opportunity to cast a mail ballot. At the same time, states should maintain or expand in-person voting options consistent with public health mandates. This is important since, as you've heard, many Americans can't or won't vote by mail. In addition, states are going to have to bolster their voter registration capacity, and especially their capacity to register voters online. And we need major investments in public education so that voters are well aware of any changes to voting rules and procedures. Now, that's the high level. In a little bit more detail, the modifications we need to make can be broken into 5 basic categories. First is polling places. We need to ensure that in-person voting options for those who can't or won't vote by mail are safe and sanitary. That means everything from relocating polling places outside of senior care facilities, to reconfiguring polling places to allow for social distancing, to sanitizing polling places consistent with CDC guidance. It also means enhancing election day resources to minimize lines and intensifying poll worker recruitment efforts. Second, we believe states should expand early in-person voting options. The idea is to spread out voting over more days and locations to minimize crowds on election day. Third, a universal mail voting option. The debate over mail voting has grown increasingly sharp in recent weeks, but the reality is that every state allows at least some voters to cast a mail ballot, and most states allow every voter to cast a mail ballot. So the question for most of the country isn't whether all voters can vote a mail ballot, it's whether election officials are going to be prepared for a surge in use. There's a number of steps they need to start working on now to get ready. It means printing enough ballots in ballot envelopes, acquiring machines and staff to process those ballots and requests for them, relaxing deadlines for ballots to be requested and returned, and implementing reasonable, non-discriminatory processes for counting and evaluating the validity of those ballots. Fourth category, enhance voter registration options and capacity. Historically, most people have registered to vote in person. We're anticipating a potential surge in online registration as a result of the virus. And in response, states need to test and bolster their online systems. More generally, they need to up their capacity to process registration applications and extend registration deadlines if needed. The fifth and final piece of this is voter education. Major modifications to the system are needed, but it's not enough to just make the changes. Voters need to be informed about them, especially given the risks of serious disinformation campaigns around the election. Let me just emphasize that for all of these modifications, as you've heard, we need to ensure that language access and disability access are accounted for. In closing, let me just say we can do this. These are significant changes, but they're achievable. We need Congress to step up and get states the money they need as soon as possible, because we have time to protect our elections against the crisis, but we have no time to waste. I encourage all of you on this call to make your voices heard and demand real protections for our democracy in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Max, for talking us through those incredibly important and detailed solutions. I appreciate you being here. And common sense policies like accessible early voting, posted page, no excuse, vote by mail, among others, will go a long way in ensuring Americans can have their voices heard this November. But Congress must provide the $4 billion that states need in order to implement these reforms. Our next speakers come from 2 incredible activist organizations with chapters all over the United States. First, we have Deborah Cronmiller, the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, who will give us a cautionary tale based on her experience with the state's recent primary election. Then we'll hear from Karen Hobart Flynn, the President of Common Cause, who will discuss how citizens can exert pressure on their local governments to enact the reforms that Max and others have discussed to secure our elections. Deborah?
Diana, thank you so much, and thank DFED for all you do. As everyone in the nation saw, a good many things went wrong with Wisconsin's spring election and presidential primary. One of the biggest issues was the contradictory messaging sent by the governor about holding an election. He issued an executive order to be safer at home, but exempted voting from the order. Days before the election, he called a special legislative session, hoping the legislature would act to postpone the election. And only when they failed to do so did he finally call for the election to be postponed. only to have the courts determine he did not have the authority to do so. Educating the voting public on how to successfully request and submit an absentee ballot was a tremendous challenge in such a short period of time. The need for so many voters to use the absentee ballot option brought to light problems associated with voting by mail. Not all voters have access to computers and the internet. The elimination of the special voting deputies to help those who are shut in, elderly, and disabled meant they could not easily cast their ballots. And the acceptance that people of color, those known to have higher same-day registration and voting rates, would be disenfranchised. It's important to note that Wisconsin's extremely gerrymandered district lines emboldened the elected majority in the state to act in their own political interest and not in the best interest of their constituents' health and safety. At the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, we work closely with the National League leadership and staff on everything from litigation to support our messaging. And we took the time in the moment and continue to learn from this experience, and will work to ensure that the greatest number of voters can successfully exercise their right to vote in all our upcoming elections. No voter should have to choose between their health and their right to vote in Wisconsin or in any other state. And we want to do our part to support those communities who were disproportionately impacted in this process. It was Milwaukee for us, but it could just as easily have been any other similar community in your state. And while Wisconsin proved to be the test case of sorts around the importance of ensuring adequate and safe in-person polling places, it will be important that we do what we can to avoid this situation across the country for the 40+ states who still have primaries between now and summer, to make sure that we are all best positioned for November. Thank you for the opportunity to share our experience at the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, and I hope you all remain safe and healthy in this election.
Thank you so much, Deborah. We really appreciate you telling that story, and we are all really eager to work with you and activists around the country to make sure something like that never happens again. And now I want to turn it over to Karen.
Thank you, Jana. As president of Common Cause, I'm very proud to represent our 1.2 million members and our staff in 30 states as we work on a broad array of democracy issues and many of the reforms that we're talking about needing to do here tonight. I want to thank each of you for joining us to hear about this critical issue, and to thank Senators Klobuchar, Wyden, Warren, House Democratic Caucus Chair Hakeem, Jeffries, and Secretary of State Wyman for their incredible leadership to protect our elections. Clearly, the COVID-19 pandemic presents an unprecedented challenge to our country, and ensuring public health and bolstering our economy are absolutely intertwined with protecting the health of our democracy and the right to vote. Common Cause state leaders and our allies are working on a daily basis with election officials at the state level to push for a package of reforms that will make voting safe and accessible for everyone. And the challenge is that in each state, it varies their infrastructure, whether they have vote by mail. We helped pass a vote by mail package in Colorado over time that have vote centers so people could vote in person, have same-day voter registration, and many reforms. But states are in a different place, and we need to rely on experts at the state level, like our partners at the League, Brennan Center, and many on this call, to be working on how we can make voting as accessible and safe as possible for people. And there are many ways for you to engage in that work. We have some states, that like Alaska, Indiana, New Hampshire, and New York, whether it's Democratic control or Republican control, that are rising to the challenge and expanding voting opportunities through different reforms. But the challenge is also some states are politicizing this effort. Real challenges in states Arizona, Michigan, Missouri, Texas, Kentucky, and others, where some Republican officials are fighting against even modest changes to boost voting access and are openly blocking common sense reforms that could protect the health of voters. For example, in Arizona, Governor Ducey says he's opposed to conducting the Arizona August 4th primary by mail. In Texas, the state refused to extend absentee ballot availability due to, and a court had to come in and release an injunction to ensure that all eligible voters in Texas could request an absentee ballot. In Michigan, the Secretary of State, a Democrat, Jocelyn Benson, said her state needs $40 to hold a mostly vote by mail in November, but the Republican legislature won't go along with it. The interesting thing is, these are the kinds of reforms Common Cause and other groups have been passing state level bipartisan support. Polls show these reforms, independents, Republicans, and Democrats, and we move these measures. People who say that this is politicized, they're wrong. So we are doing things. If you're interested in some of these state fights, you can connect with Common Cause. We have a COVID-19 page outlining some of the reforms to urge Congress, as you've heard from other speakers, to put money on the table. We need $4 billion total to go to states so that they can pay for these reforms and pay for the public education effort required to make that happen. And you'll hear a little bit later in the call, we also need to call Republicans in the Senate in particular and ask them to support that $4 billion and also write letters to the editor and other ways to reach your members of Congress, because remember, they are also sheltering in place. So lastly, I want to say that I want to thank the Declaration for American Democracy for pulling us all together to talk about these issues and for you joining us in this fight. We can win this fight, but we need your help.
Thank you so much to Deborah and Karen for your really inspiring remarks. We appreciate you being here and we look forward to continuing this work together. So one thing is very clear from our last few speakers, and that is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to ensuring that every voter can access the ballot. And that is why Congress must pass common sense reforms like those we've discussed here today. Safe early voting, no excuse vote by mail, online voter registration, and other requirements to ensure the safety of voters and poll workers. Congress must allocate the $4 billion needed by the states to get this done. So if you feel as outraged as I did listening to the stories of voter disenfranchisement talked about by Benita, Michelle, and Deborah, and you're asking yourself now, well, what can I do to help? This next panel has the answers. So I'd like to introduce Rio Tazwell, the Senior Campaigns Manager at People for the American Way, Brett Edkins, the Political Director at Stand Up America, and Christine Wood, Democracy Organizer for Public Citizens Democracy is for People campaign. Rio, why don't you kick things off?
Great. Thank you so much, Jenna. It's great to be with you all. Again, my name is Rio Tazwell. I'm the Senior Campaigns Manager at People for the American Way. And I just want to start by thanking all of you, the thousands and thousands of people that are viewing this and will come to see this live stream, for taking part in this effort. We are clearly living in such a pivotal moment in history, and everything that we do, all of our decisions, will impact what happens in the coming months and years and even decades. And it's so critically important that we take the time to educate ourselves and others about the vital reforms that we've been hearing about all evening to safeguard our democracy. Because as has been said, it is simply unacceptable for people to have to choose between their health and their vote. It is fundamentally un-American for people to have to make that choice. And we are working to try to make sure that people can participate in our democracy without putting their health in jeopardy. So as we've been hearing this evening, Congress is going to be voting on another round of stimulus. We're asking for $4 billion to be allocated for these reforms that have been discussed by our colleagues. And the Declaration for American Democracy has been mobilizing our 150 participant organizations around this effort. We represent millions, if not tens of millions of Americans that are concerned about a wide range of issues. And we've come together to advocate for a broad spectrum of democracy reforms, including campaign finance reform to address the influence of big money in politics, protecting the right to vote, closing the revolving door between corporations and government. But now we are fully focused on this fight that's right in front of us and the need for this funding, because nothing could be more important than making sure that people can safely participate in the upcoming elections. So we've heard from esteemed members of Congress who the Declaration for American Democracy has great relationships with. We very much value all of the leadership that we've seen on the Hill. We've heard from esteemed policy experts who have laid out some of these reforms, what they can do and why they're necessary. But myself and my colleagues that'll be speaking with you in just a minute represent the grassroots mobilization piece of this coalition, because that is where the change really happens. As I mentioned, we represent millions, if not tens of millions of Americans. In order to achieve these objectives that we're hearing about tonight and to safeguard our democracy, we need to make sure that our voices are heard. And that means we need to use all of the tools that are available at our disposal to put pressure on Congress, particularly the Senate right now. And there's a number of things that can be done. And it's absolutely essential that we take these actions, because believe it or not, members of Congress are really paying attention to how many calls they get. They're paying attention to how the media covers them, particularly in their state or in their district. And every single phone call, every single letter to the editor, every single tweet, every single share of this video can help bring the awareness that's needed in order to win this funding and hopefully safeguard our democracy. So I could not encourage everyone watching this video enough to share it and take part in these actions and get involved with us at declarationforamericandemocracy.org.
All right, thanks, Rio. Let's turn it over now to Brett.
Thanks, Rio and Jana. Hi, everyone. I'm Brett Edkins from Stand Up America. I'm here to ask you to take 3 minutes out of your day to call Congress to demand the $4 billion we need to expand vote by mail and early voting. Grab a pen and paper, because I'm going to give you a phone number. Stand Up America's members have already made over 110,000 calls to Congress. Just last week, we drove tens of thousands of additional calls with the help of Daily Kos, Indivisible, and this amazing coalition. As someone who has worked on Capitol Hill, I can tell you that these calls are noticed and that they make a difference. So please call your senators. Here's the number, 1-888-415-4527. Ask them to provide $4 billion in funding to secure our elections in the next coronavirus relief package. You can also find that number at declarationforamericandemocracy.org/call. With your help, no voter will have to choose between participating in our democracy and their health. Thank you. Christine?
Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Wood, and I'm here to talk to you today about the power of publishing letters to the editor. Letters to the editor play a key role in advocacy. A letter in your local paper has the ability to educate your community and catch the attention of your members of Congress. Now that many publications are online, we have an even greater opportunity to make an impact by sharing our letters on social media. Tonight, we're asking everyone watching to submit a letter to the editor to your local paper this week. And we've even published an online tool that can help you do that. But first, let's go over some best practices. Every letter to the editor should include an introduction, a briefing on the problem, and a clear solution or ask. So for my letter, I might start by saying I'm a lifelong resident of Syracuse, New York. Next, I describe the problem and the solution. Specifically, that the coronavirus pandemic is putting our health and our democracy at risk, and that we need at least $4 billion to make sure that every person has safe options to vote. Then, I'd conclude by restating my ask, which is that Congress must pass $4 billion in the next stimulus bill to secure our elections. Lastly, I'd spell check it. I'd reach out to my local paper to submit my letter, and I'd politely follow up on my submission. So now my ask is for everyone on this call to schedule time this week to write a letter to the editor. You can use our tool. It's at declarationforamericandemocracy.org/LTE. It makes it very easy for you to submit a letter to the editor to your local paper. Together, we can show the overwhelming support for safe and secure elections. So again, visit declarationforamericandemocracy.org/LTE to get started today. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Rio, Brett, and Christine, for your leadership and for your tireless activism on this issue. And most importantly, thank you to everyone who tuned in to today's bipartisan town hall. Your voice is essential in this fight and to ensure that you and your fellow Americans can safely vote in our elections. I again want to thank all of our amazing speakers, especially Senator Klobuchar, Senator Wyden, Senator Warren, House Democratic Caucus Chairman Jeffries, and Secretary of State Kim Wyman, and all those who took the time today to underscore the need for swift action and solutions from Congress to secure our right to safely and fairly vote in our elections. Now, following today's bipartisan kickoff event, the Declaration for American Democracy will be working with our partners to host state-focused town halls in Maine, Arizona, North Carolina, Colorado, and Georgia. Our next virtual town hall is coming up very soon in Maine this Thursday, April 23rd at 7 p.m. Eastern. And our featured guest will be Senator Angus King, and participants will be able to directly ask him questions about what Congress is doing to secure our democracy. Also, once this live stream is done, please share it with your networks and share our action requests with them as well. To participate in the upcoming town hall, simply go to the events section of our Facebook page. And while you're there, make sure to like the page and we'll let you know about other important upcoming events. And if you prefer Twitter, follow us there too. Our handle is @DFAD Coalition, or simply search for Declaration for American Democracy. And of course, you can find all of this information on our website, declarationforamericandemocracy.org, including the letter to the editor tool that Christine mentioned that will help you to share your message of how we will defend democracy during COVID-19 far and wide and in a matter of minutes. So whether it be a tweet, a phone call, or a letter to the editor, your voice is needed now more than ever. And we hope that you leave this broadcast ready and eager to take action. Thank you again for listening in. Stay safe and good night.